the earth was not too much different than it is today. That is when life came into existence. Now, of great importance is the nature of the atmosphere. What was the atmosphere like then? Was it similar to the one that we have today, or was it very different? Well, the evolutionists must imagine that the hypothetical primitive Earth, the atmosphere of that Earth, was very different than it is today. You see, our atmosphere today consists of about 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. That's 99% of everything. The other 1% is mainly argon, with, of course, some water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and very, very small amounts of other gases. Now, life could never have evolved in such an atmosphere. It's physically impossible. You see, with all of that oxygen present, if there were any amino acids or sugars or something like that generated on the hypothetical primordial Earth, they would have been rapidly oxidized and destroyed. They would have been converted to carbon dioxide and water and nitrogen and things like that. So the evolutionist says, well, obviously, the present is not the key to the past. And things were very, very different on this primitive Earth. There was no oxygen present. You see, if we compare the present atmosphere with nitrogen and oxygen and these other gases, water vapor, to what they say must have existed, they postulate that rather than free oxygen, there was free hydrogen. Rather than carbon dioxide, there was some methane or CH4 and some carbon monoxide. Of course, there would have been some carbon dioxide. And in addition to nitrogen, there would have been ammonia, NH3, and of course there would have been water vapor. So he says, all right, the primitive Earth must have been very different. And so we will suggest, we will imagine that the primitive Earth atmosphere consisted of such things as methane, ammonia, hydrogen, water vapor, and stuff like that. And all of the early experiments were performed using that sort of mixture of gases. Well, since that time, geological evidence has been developed, has shown conclusively that the Earth never had a methane ammonia atmosphere. Ammonia would be rapidly destroyed by ultraviolet light. It would be decomposed rapidly into nitrogen and hydrogen. I want you to note, even a very simple molecule like ammonia cannot exist in the presence of ultraviolet light that would be coming from the sun. Now that might say something about the fate of other molecules, wouldn't it? But they've come to recognize that ammonia could not have existed on the primitive Earth, and there's no evidence that there was ever any methane or anything like that. There's no evidence of any deposits of such compounds on the Earth. And fact is, we have great deposits of sulfate, which is highly oxidized sulfur, in rocks that are supposed to be very, very ancient, 2 billion years or more. And there's red beds, which are deposits of oxidized iron in the ferric state. And the distribution of certain minerals, of uranium and iron, carbon and sulfur, in rocks that are supposed to be very, very old, rocks that are supposed to be more than 2 billion years old. The distribution of those minerals are just the same as in rocks that are supposed to be very young, known to have been deposited under an atmosphere similar to our own. So the geologists have said that the distribution of these minerals are determined by the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. And since there's no difference in the distribution of these minerals, either in very young rocks or in these rocks which we believe to be, they believe to be 2 to 3 billion years old, there must have been just as much oxygen in the atmosphere then as there is today. And some geologists have said that there is no evidence that the Earth ever had an atmosphere different than the one we have today. The evidence seems to be conclusive in that respect. Now that settles the question. I mean, life could not have evolved under an atmosphere similar to the one that we have today. It's impossible. And so really we don't even have to look at any further evidence. If this is true, we could dismiss the entire idea that life has evolved on this planet. But let us look at some of the other evidence that is so commonly suggested today as suggestive that life may have evolved on this planet. Now, if life evolved, we have to account for the generation of what I have called these relatively simple substances. The building blocks you see of DNA and RNA and protein and things like that. For example, DNA and RNA has these purines that are the important substituents of DNA and RNA. We have to account for huge quantities of adenine and guanine. Now, I want to emphasize that these substances must have been produced in enormous quantities on the earth. It had to be very efficient. I'm not talking about a few parts per billion or a few parts per million. You see, on the earth, we have 350 million cubic miles of water. Now, evolutionists postulate that this water was generated very early in the history of the earth. So we've always had a tremendous quantity of water on the earth. Now, if something would make up a significant concentration in all of that water, you have to have billions and billions and billions of tons of every one of these molecules, whatever it is. You must have enormous quantities because you see, everything eventually gets dissolved in the waters of the ocean. If it's on land, it may be temporarily concentrated in some pond or stream, but it's going to rain, it's going to flush it out into the ocean, and everything eventually gets dissolved in all that water. So we have to have some very efficient method to produce these substances. We have to produce adenine. We've got to have such things as cytosine and thymine. Those must be produced. Each one of them, each molecule, in billions and billions of tons of this stuff, you see. And these substances, the purines and the pyrimidines, they are called nitrogenous bases. Each unit of a DNA and an RNA molecule is called a nucleotide. That's the building block. A nucleotide is a building block of DNA and RNA. Each nucleotide consists of one of these nitrogenous bases, the purines or pyrimidines, adenine, thymine, guanine, or cytosine. It consists of one of those combined with a sugar. In the case of DNA, it's deoxyribose. In the case of RNA, it's ribose. And phosphoric acid. So we must have tremendous quantities of each one of these purines and pyrimidines. We must have tremendous quantities of the sugars. And we must have tremendous quantities of the phosphoric acid dissolved in the primitive ocean, you see, if life evolved. And, of course, they must be combined one with another. The nucleotides, each unit, combines with other nucleotides to make these long chains that we call DNA and RNA. Thousands of these nucleotides are combined to make each gene. One gene in the human that codes for blood clotting factor number 8 has 186,000. 186,000 nucleotides joined together in this long chain, enormous DNA molecule. Now, I'm not saying that the first primitive cell, hypothetical primitive cell, had to have a gene with 186,000 nucleotides, but we had to get there from somewhere, you see, so that was really a problem for the evolutionists. Now, in addition to the DNA and RNA, of course, we have the proteins. Proteins are an absolute essential constituent of living cells. The unit, the subunit, the building block of proteins are amino acids. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids found in living things today. Of course, on the hypothetical primordial Earth, if you could generate amino acids, there would have been many, many more than just these 20. I'd have been 100 or 200 different kinds. And these amino acids combine to make proteins. Now, a very interesting aspect of that problem is this. If you generate these amino acids on the hypothetical primordial earth by some chemical process, or if you go in the laboratory and you synthesize these things, you get 50% left-handed and 50% right-handed.